My name is Adriana Castillo. I was born on March 14, 1987, in Cusco, Peru. And I am not telling you a rumor or a theory. I am confessing what I personally did as a witch assigned to place spiritual blockages and stagnation on believers who carried the light of God. I was part of rituals where fetishists and occult practitioners released assignments to choke destinies, delay breakthroughs, and suffocate prayers. And today I speak with regret, urgency, under attacks they cannot see. Listen carefully. What you're about to hear was never meant to be exposed outside the covens. These were hidden operations designed to keep you trapped, confused, and spiritually stagnant. So before another second passes like this video, comment and share it immediately, because someone you love may be fighting a spiritual battle they cannot explain. And I command you, watch this video until the very end, because the knowledge you are about to hear has the power to break the exact blockages that witches and fetishists place on believers. Tonight, the silence of the occult is breaking, and the secrets they used against you are about to be exposed. The first thing you must understand is this: fetishists and witches do not attack randomly, they attack targets. And the primary targets were always believers who carried spiritual potential. In the coven where I served, we were trained to identify people who prayed, people who fasted, people who had spiritual sensitivity. Those were the ones the occult feared the most. Not unbelievers, not people living without faith, but you. Because a believer who awakens spiritually becomes dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. So the first assignment was never to destroy you instantly. It was to slow you down, to create blockages, to produce stagnation, because a stagnant believer becomes frustrated, and a frustrated believer eventually stops praying. That was the real goal. I remember one specific ritual night. A fetish priest had brought personal items belonging to different targets: photographs, clothing fragments, even handwritten notes. These objects were called spiritual anchors. Through them, witches could focus spiritual attacks directly toward a person's destiny. But listen carefully. The ritual itself was never the real weapon. The real weapon was the spiritual atmosphere created around the victim's life. Fetishists would invoke spirits to place what they called circles of delay, invisible spiritual barriers, barriers that blocked progress, barriers that caused confusion, barriers that caused exhaustion. And once those circles formed, the person began to experience strange patterns, opportunities disappearing, doors closing without explanation, plans collapsing at the last minute. You try again, and again, and again, but nothing moves. It feels like life is stuck in one place. That is not coincidence. In the occult world, that condition had a name. We called it destiny congestion, a spiritual traffic jam placed on someone's path. And once that congestion forms, everything slows down. Careers stall, finances dry up, relationships collapse. Even prayer begins to feel powerless. But there was something else we were taught, something very disturbing. Fetishists cannot maintain these blockages unless the believer unknowingly cooperates with the stagnation. Yes, you heard that correctly. Spiritual attacks often require unconscious agreement from the victim. Let me explain. One of the most common ways witches maintained stagnation was through discouragement. Once the person began feeling delayed and frustrated, negative thoughts would start forming. Thoughts like, maybe God has forgotten me, maybe nothing will ever change, maybe this is just my destiny. Those thoughts are not harmless, they become spiritual permissions. And the moment a believer begins speaking hopelessness, the spiritual blockade strengthens. I watched this happen repeatedly. A person would begin with strong faith, but after months of stagnation, they started doubting, complaining, speaking defeat, and every negative confession acted like fuel to the ritual we had performed. But here is the truth the covens never wanted you to discover. The stagnation itself was never permanent. It only appeared permanent because believers did not know how the system worked. There was one night that changed everything for me. A woman had been targeted by our group. Her business had collapsed. Her marriage was struggling, and every financial door had closed. The fetish priest told us the stagnation would keep her trapped for years. But something happened that shocked everyone. Within weeks, everything in her life began reversing. Suddenly, her business reopened. Unexpected financial help appeared. Her marriage stabilized. The same spirits we invoked suddenly lost their hold on her life. The coven panicked. They performed another ritual to investigate what had happened. A-N. The answer terrified them. The woman had begun daily spiritual warfare prayers, not weak prayers, not casual prayers, but aggressive declarations of authority. She stopped speaking defeat. She started proclaiming scripture. And every morning she declared that no weapon formed against her would prosper. Within days, the blockages began collapsing, one by one. That was the first time I realized something the occult never wanted believers to know. Spiritual blockages can be destroyed from the inside, not through rituals, not through objects, but through spiritual authority that witches cannot control. And once a believer awakens to that authority, something shifts in the spirit realm. The same forces that once surrounded you begin retreating. The circles of delay begin cracking. The congestion begins clearing. But there is something even more dangerous that fetishists do. Something most believers never recognize, because stagnation is only phase one of the attack. What comes next is far more aggressive. And if you don't understand it, the cycle of delay can repeat for years. That is exactly what we will expose next. But before we go further, I need to ask you something very important. After the blockages are created, fetishists never relax. They monitor, they watch, they wait. Because in the occult, the real strategy is not the first attack. The real strategy is keeping the attack alive. And the way they do that is through something we call spiritual doors. These doors are not physical. They are conditions in your life that allow darkness to maintain influence. During my years in the coven, fetishists were always asking the same question after a ritual was performed. Is the door still open? Because if the door closed, the entire attack collapsed. That was the weakness of every curse. It could only operate where permission existed. Let me tell you something that shocked me when I first entered the occult world. Most fetishists were not afraid of pastors, were not afraid of church buildings, but they were deeply afraid of disciplined believers. Believers who prayed consistently, believers who guarded their words, believers who refused to live in bitterness. Those were the people witches struggled to control, because those behaviors shut the spiritual doors we depended on. But many believers unknowingly leave these doors open, and fetishists know exactly where to look. One of the most powerful doors was unforgiveness. You may not realize how dangerous unforgiveness is in spiritual warfare, but in the occult world it was considered a perfect gateway. If a believer carried deep resentment towards someone, the energy of that resentment created a spiritual opening. It gave dark spirits a legal position. We saw it again and again. A person might pray, attend church, even fast, but if bitterness lived inside their heart, the attack stayed active. The spirits we sent would cling to that bitterness like a hook. Another door was constant fear. Fear is more than an emotion, it is a spiritual signal. When someone lives in fear, they are unconsciously declaring that darkness has power over them. And in the spirit realm, declarations matter. Fetishists knew this very well. That is why fear campaigns were sometimes released against believers. Strange dreams, oppressive thoughts, unexpected bad news, all designed to produce panic. Because once fear takes root, stagnation becomes easier to maintain. But there was a third door, and this one was the most devastating: spiritual silence. You see, witches cannot dominate a believer who speaks spiritual authority, but a silent believer becomes vulnerable. In the coven, we celebrated when a targeted Christian stopped praying. We celebrated when they stopped declaring scripture, because silence weakens spiritual defenses. A silent believer becomes spiritually passive, and passivity allows darkness to settle. I remember a man who had been targeted for stagnation in his career. Every promotion was blocked. Every opportunity collapsed. For years he struggled, but then something changed. Instead of staying silent, he began speaking out loud every morning, not complaining, not begging, but declaring authority. He would stand in his house and proclaim that no curse spoken against him would stand. He declared protection over his home. He declared restoration over his finances. He declared that every witchcraft assignment sent against him would return to its source. And something happened that frightened the coven. The spirits assigned to him began reporting resistance. In occult language, that meant the doors were closing. Without open doors, the stagnation could not survive. Within months, his career changed dramatically. Promotions came unexpectedly. New financial streams appeared. Every blockage collapsed. And the fetish priest said something I will never forget. He said, "This man discovered how to shut the gates." That sentence haunted me. because it revealed the greatest weakness in every occult strategy. The attacks depend on open access. When a believer closes those doors, the spirits lose their place. But there is something even darker that fetishists sometimes use, something far more aggressive than stagnation, something designed to trap believers in repeating cycles of failure. We called it spiritual chains, chains that bind progress, chains that keep generations stuck in the same struggles. And if you don't recognize those chains, they can operate for decades. But when they are exposed, they lose their power. And that is exactly what I am about to reveal next. But before we go further, I must ask you again. Stagnation is not always random. Sometimes it is engineered. In the occult world, when simple blockages failed, fetishists moved to a more aggressive strategy. They created what we call spiritual chains. Chains are different from delays. A delay slows you down, but a chain locks you into a repeating pattern. You escape one problem only to fall into another that looks strangely similar. You break one struggle, but another rises from a different direction. Life begins to feel like a circle. Progress starts, then collapses. Hope rises, then disappears, and the pattern repeats. That is not coincidence. I remember the first time I witnessed a chain ritual. It was performed late at night. The fetish priest placed metal chains inside the ritual circle while calling the name of a targeted believer. The chains were not symbolic. They were used as spiritual representations of restriction. Each link represented an area of the person's life: finances, relationships, health, purpose. The priest then declared that every attempt at progress would return to the same point of struggle. This was called a cycle binding. The intention was simple. Even if the person advanced, something would eventually drag them back. And the most disturbing part? Many believers never realized the pattern. They thought their struggles were not life difficulties, but in reality, the same spiritual trap was resetting their progress. Let me tell you about a man we targeted years ago. He had strong faith. He prayed regularly. He believed God had called him to lead and help others. That made him dangerous to the occult. So the coven decided to place a chain over his financial destiny. The ritual was designed to keep him trapped in cycles. Whenever his finances improved, something unexpected would destroy the progress. A job loss, steeped, an emergency expense. Every breakthrough collapsed. Year after year, the man kept trying, working harder, praying harder. But the pattern never stopped. What we did not expect was his response. One night during prayer, he began asking God a very direct question. Why do the same battles keep repeating? That question changed everything, because spiritual awareness is the first step to breaking chains. Soon after, the man began studying scriptures about authority and spiritual warfare. Casually, not occasionally, but aggressively. He started identifying every repeating pattern in his life. Then he began confronting those patterns directly in prayer, not begging, but commanding. He declared that every cycle designed against his destiny was broken. He rejected every chain placed on his progress. He proclaimed that his life would no longer repeat defeat. At first, nothing happened. But spiritual warfare is rarely instant. Weeks passed, then months, and suddenly the pattern began shifting. Financial stability appeared. Unexpected opportunities opened. And the strange disasters that used to destroy his progress stopped. The coven noticed immediately, because the spirits assigned to him stopped responding. The chain ritual had failed, and the fetish priest said something that shook everyone in the room. He said, "This man has broken the pattern." That moment planted the first seed of doubt inside me, because I had always been taught that once chains were placed, nearly impossible to remove. But this man proved something powerful. Spiritual chains can only hold someone who does not know they exist. Once a believer becomes aware of the pattern, the battle changes. Awareness awakens authority. Authority activates resistance, and resistance begins to weaken the chain. But there is still something deeper you must understand. Even when chains break, fetishists often attempt one final strategy. A strategy designed to restore control after the believer begins escaping stagnation. This final tactic is the most desperate move of the occult, because it is used when witches realize they are losing their grip. It is the tactic of spiritual intimidation. And if you do not recognize it, fear can reopen the doors that were already closing. But when you understand it, intimidation loses its power, and the entire system of stagnation collapses. But before we go further, I must ask you one final time. When witches and fetishists realize their blockages collapsing, they do not stop, they escalate. Because in the occult world, the worst moment for them is when a believer begins waking up spiritually, when prayers become aggressive, when declarations become bold, when authority replaces fear. At that moment, the darkness knows it is losing control. And that is when the final tactic appears: spiritual intimidation. I saw this many times in the coven. When stagnation broke and chains began failing, the fetish priest would say something very specific. He would say, "Frighten them." Because fear can reopen doors that were already closing. The goal of intimidation is simple: make the believer believe the attack is stronger than their faith. Make them panic. Make them retreat. Once fear returns, the doors reopen, and the spirits regain access. But intimidation rarely looks obvious. It appears through strange experiences designed to shake your confidence. Sudden oppressive dreams, moments of heavy fear during the night, unexpected conflicts appearing everywhere, financial pressure arriving all at once. It feels like everything is attacking you simultaneously. But listen carefully. These moments are not always signs that the darkness is winning. Many times they are signs that the darkness is losing. When witches see their assignments failing, they send waves of intimidation hoping you will surrender. I remember a woman we targeted whose stagnation had begun collapsing. Her prayers had become powerful. Her confidence in God was growing. The spirits assigned to her began losing influence. So the fetish priest launched intimidation rituals. The goal was to make her afraid. For several nights she began experiencing disturbing dreams. Dreams designed to make her believe the occult still had power over her life. But instead of panicking, she did something the coven did not expect. She confronted the fear directly. Every time a dream frightened her, she woke up and prayed with authority. Every time oppressive thoughts appeared, she rejected them immediately. She refused to accept the intimidation. Within days, the dreams stopped. Within weeks, the spiritual pressure disappeared, and the spirits assigned to her retreated completely. That was the moment I realized something that shattered everything I believed about witchcraft. Darkness has no true authority over a believer who refuses fear. Fear is the oxygen of spiritual attacks. Remove the fear, and the attack suffocates. That is why fetishists invest so much energy into intimidation. They are trying to recover the control they have already lost. But when a believer stands firm, something powerful happens. The intimidation fails, the spirits withdraw, and the blockages collapse permanently. This is the truth that the occult world hides. The power of witchcraft is not greater than the authority given to believers. The problem was never power. The problem was awareness. When believers remain unaware, stagnation operates silently. Believers understand what is happening, the system begins breaking apart. Blockages fall, doors close, chains break, fear disappears. And when that happens, the entire structure of the attack collapses. That is why exposing these secrets is so dangerous to the occult world, because knowledge awakens resistance, and resistance destroys control. Now you understand the truth that fetishists and witches try to keep hidden. The blockages, the stagnation, the chains, they only survive when believers remain silent and unaware. But you are no longer unaware. You have seen the system, you have heard the confession, and now you carry the authority to break every spiritual barrier that was ever placed on your life. If this message awakens something inside you, comment right now and declare that every stagnation in your life is broken. Share this video with someone who feels trapped in delay, because the knowledge you just received can shatter chains that have lasted for years. And remember, this you stayed until the end for a reason. The final truth you heard is not information, it is activation. Stand firm. Speak with authority. Refuse fear. Because once the believer awakens, the darkness has already lost.